Hello again and welcome back to our course on Access 2019. In this section we're going to continue looking at queries and in particular joins. Now when you need to go to more than one table to get the information you need to join the information from a number of tables. And the way the information is joined is very important and it can sometimes be tricky to work out how to join. So I'm going to cover a couple of basic examples of SQL queries that involve joins of tables. Now we're going to carry on using our test query or query test, and I'm going to go into Design View. And I'm going to clear out this criteria, so I'm just going to delete out that and that. And I'll also do away with the sort for the moment. But I am still going to reference the trip table. Now if I right click on the upper part in the query designer and select show table, I'm going to go through here and I'm going to add the trip country table and just click on add. Now I'm going to close that down for a moment. Now for the avoidance of confusion, when we originally set the trip table up, we started off by putting a country in there as a field in the trip table. Now we don't use that any longer. We use the trip country table to provide a list of countries for each trip. Now when I added this second table, Access looked to see if there are any relationships between these two, and of course there are, and you can see that relationship just there in the middle. So now I'm going to run a query to list the countries for each trip. So I'm going to remove activity level. I'm going to remove duration days, and I'm just pressing delete to get rid of those. But I'm going to include the country from the trip country table. Now you can see that we need a join as there are two countries involved in this query. That is country from the Tubble trip and country from Tubble trip country. So before we look at the join, let's first of all run this query. So I'm going to click on run. Now you might be a little surprised by the results. There are a number of records, but you don't see all of the trips or all of the countries. Now first of all, whenever you run a query, the set of records that comes out as a result is normally referred to as the query record set. So the record set here has 10 or so records, and they certainly don't include all of the trips or all of the countries. Now I'll explain why by going into SQL View. So here you can see the select statement, and if you look at that second line, you can see we have something in here that says inner join. And what inner join does is to say that we're only going to include records that exist in both the trip table and the trip country table. And how we match those is whatever is specified in the on condition just there. And the on condition is that the ID in the trip table equals the ID in the trip country table. So it's basically saying we are going to see a list of trips and the countries they go to, but we're only going to show trips where there is a country, and we're only going to show countries where there is a trip. And of course, if you remember back to the beginning, I never actually finished setting up the trip country records in this database. So if I open up the trip country table, you will see the trips that I've set up countries for. And there's definitely a few of them missing from there. So let's go back to our query and go back into Design View. So our first job here is that an inner join that says I must have records in both parts of the join. So when I added the trip country table to Design View, Access would have looked at the relationships I had made it aware of and realized that there is a relationship between trip and trip country. And as I said previously, you can see that indicated just here. So it's formed that inner join on the basis of that relationship. Now let me double click on the relationship to bring up the join properties. And you can see here it says left table name is Tubble trip, right table name Tubble trip country, left column name is ID, right column name trip ID. So you can see how those are linked together. We then have three options, and the first one is selected because it is the default option. And it says only include rows where the joined fields from both tables are equal. The second says include all records from TubbleTrip and only those records from TubbleTrip country where the joined fields are equal. And the third option, include all records from TubbleTrip country and only those records from TubbleTrip where the joined fields are equal. So let's take a look at what happens if I was to select this second option. I'm going to click on OK and let's run the query. Now what I get is a list that includes all of the trips, but for the trips that don't have any countries, I can still see them, they just don't have the countries shown. And if we jump back into SQL view, you will see the inner join has now been changed to say left join. Now left join means include all of the records on the left, so everything in trip table, but there will only be an entry on the right where an entry on the right exists. So in this case we have all of the trips, but some don't have the countries they visit recorded. So having seen inner joins and left joins, you may be tempted to think, well, why don't we just do a right join? Well, to be honest with you, that wouldn't tell us much in this scenario. What it would say is I want to include everything in the trip country table, but only corresponding entries in the trip table on the left. And everything in the trip country table must have an entry in the trip table on the left due to referential integrity. So in this situation, that doesn't really help us too much. But let's look at an instance where you might use right join. I'm going to jump into Design View and I'm going to show the country table. And I'm going to remove trip country completely. Now notice the relationship between trip and country. In this case we have a relationship based on the old country field in the trip record. So I'm going to take country from the country table, and we've already got trip name from the trip table, and I'm going to double click on that join. I'm going to say I'm looking at right, and let's run that query. Now of course, because we are referencing the country table, we get all of the countries on the right, and on the left we get the trips that mention that country in that specific field. So remember, this is not using the trip country table anymore, it's just using the contents of the country field in the trip record. So that gives you an example of a right join, and if we jump into SQL, you can see there now it says right join. Now it might take you a while to get used to joins, but you'll find that there's something that you're going to use a lot when you start working more with Access, and they can help you put together some really useful queries.